So first of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Buerger. I'm a technologist within Intel's SDN division. I'm also the chair of the ODL marketing work group. And what we're going to talk about today is actually executing against a vision that, and a term that you've heard over and over again here at the event, and that is S3P. Testing ODL for stability, for scalability, for security, and for performance. And that is such a big topic, actually, that I've brought along two engineers with me, and I'm going to quickly introduce them. Sandeep from HP, as well as Marcus from Intel. And all three of us are going to engage in you with a conversation about this topic. How do we actually test ODL, not only at the component level, but also at a system level? And that's where you find the meaning behind the title for the session. So what are we going to talk about today? Essentially, we're going to start the conversation with a review of where we're at. What is the status quo that we've accomplished with lithium? Then we'd like to structure a conversation with you around two new concepts that we're going to propose to the community with regards to improving the way ODL is tested in the future. Some of them are going to be, we believe, implementable within the beryllium timeframe, but some of them are probably more directional of where we'd like to see the test effort evolve. And these two activities are actually very simple. One of them is to test ODL at a system level. And for many of us who have done software testing, system level testing has a particular meaning, right? It involves testing the system under test or the software under test from multiple vectors at the same time. The second key idea that we're going to talk about today is to develop profiles, effectively a set of test methodologies and test scripts that are specific to particular use cases. Right? What we have talked about, what we've heard at the conference today and yesterday was that there are use cases that you as a community have prioritized as key use cases for ODL. NFV is one of them. Campus is another one. The data center is another one. And we're going to provide some food for thought and hopefully some discussion along those kind of proposals to structure our test effort to more closely align with key use cases that you as the community have identified. So another point that I want to highlight is that we don't have all of the answers here. This is meant to be a directional discussion around a number of proposals. So if you have any thoughts, comments, input during the presentation, by all means, we don't have to wait until the end and when the distance to the cold beer is getting shorter and shorter. Let's have a conversation here and do that. And with that, I'll just hand it off to Marcus. And he's going to start the conversation and go into more details on the current state of affairs with regards to CI testing.
Hello, my name is Marcus Williams.
Whoops.
I just got Marcus Williams. I'm a network software engineer with Intel. I work on the SDN controller team working on Open Daylight. So I'm hopeful that this is accurate, but since this community is ever changing, I actually had to change the slide about a half hour ago after I saw an actual presentation at an OpenFlow program because I hadn't actually known about a couple of the tests. But I guess what I'd like to say is that there's currently a limited amount of scalability, stability, security, and performance testing happening in Open Daylight right now. But going forward, it's going to be ever important for people adopting Open Daylight for them to have information about how Open Daylight performs in these key categories. So we know Open Daylight's it's an OpenFlow controller. I mean, OpenFlow is the core of SDN, and so the fact that most of the tests are OpenFlow centric is pretty. It makes sense. So historical and current S3P testing are mostly focused on the OpenFlow plugin. So from what I know, there are around 6 tests that are doing scale or performance or stability right now currently in CI. There's available performance numbers using Cbench and OpenFlow 1.0. There are also tests that use Mininet and do scale tests. There are also end-to-end REST API tests that test the OpenFlow using the REST API. But there are limitations with the current ways we're testing. And when you put other plugins in the software stack, that will change the equation. And right now we're pretty single-dimensional when we're testing when we're using these test tools and when we're using, like, say, one plugin that has certain dependency chains, and we don't have OVSDB or SFC in that software stack, it gives us limited information. There are manual tests outside of the OpenFlow plugin that people have been running. One-off tests, and OVSDB, I know there were people running scale tests, but they were using just command line commands. They didn't put it in CI. And so it's limited in its use as far as the community and using those numbers over time. I'd like to go to an example of like one of the tests that's currently in CI. So this is the OpenFlow southbound performance test. Jamo's in the crowd here. He actually wrote the code for this. So I just wanted to use this as an example of this is great work that's happened in the last 6 months. We didn't know anything about what Open Daylight was doing in performance before about 6 months ago, I guess I'd say helium timeframe. So this is great work, and it's a long way coming. But what I'd like to say is that there are limitations. For example, like I said before, OpenFlow 1.0, there's no TLS involved. And most implementations are moving on to use OpenFlow 1.3. If you're using a real life use case, you'd probably want TLS involved. So this is, in some instances, limited. The usefulness of this is limited in some ways. And so I think that what Christian Buerger is talking about and what we'll talk about later is we want to actually take this test and combine it with further parts of the software stack so that we can get more of a multi-dimensional. What happens when you put in something else into the mix that could affect the performance of this plugin, or this plugin could affect the performance of something else? I'll go to the next slide, which is just it's a scale test. And I think Sandeep did most of the work on the scale tests that are here. And I believe there's another person, I can't think of off the top of my head who did it. But if you look at the first graph, you can see the max number of switches that Open Daylight can support with the OpenFlow plugin. But you can see that it's leveled off. It's right at the top. It's at 500 switches. But that's actually not a limitation of ODL. That's a limitation of the test, maybe the test design or the test number. There could be, and I think I remember reading the test where it actually scales only up to 500. It doesn't try to go above.
That's actually a question.
Oh.
So I can comment there because I've
Sure.
gone over 2,000.
Yeah. So I was actually that's the next point I was going to make is that I've heard people go up to 1,000. If you went to 2,000, then it makes perfect sense. I mean, the ODL is not limited to 500, but our current CI test is a bit limited. And I think it's just, there's probably some code that needs to be changed to actually make it get there. But then the other part of it is just using Mininet. So it's scaling with Mininet. And I think it's, if you told me, was it correct that you told me that it was using a linear topology? Is that?
Yep.
So that can cause problems because you have all the links and it's driving the CPU usage up. And so at a certain point, Mininet is going to get overwhelmed and not be able to emulate more and more switches. So I think in some ways it's limited. I'm actually working on a scale test that uses Docker, which is a little bit different methodology, and I'm hopeful that that will help solve some of those limitations. But I guess what I'd like to point out most is that it's a single dimension test. Again, it uses one plugin, and it's not using a system. It doesn't tell you what performance would be like if you're using SFC.
Is just the number of connections of switches with heartbeat, or are there actually packet in messages coming in and making,
I think that, And Sandeep can tell you more, but I think that it's the connection to the switch. Then we verify in the OpenFlow inventory that the switch is connected. When we disconnect the switch, we verify it's disconnected. But
Yeah, actually,
talk
this
more on
test was created by Luis, not me.
Oh,
I did the other
sorry.
one. The whole.
Okay, Luis. Then Luis can tell
Yes.
me.
So this test is being a topology, and then you verify that the switch is there in inventory, all the ports are available, and also that the links, it's also checking for the links. What is not checking is close.
Right.
Close is not checking.
It's also making other verifications that might fail if the logs have some multiple interception or out of memory root and stuff.
So it's making sure the controller's not dead. It's making sure that bad things aren't happening. Yeah.
Go beyond 500 for your question, because what you said there, we were told that there is mininet limitation.
Yeah.
After 500, it could be mininet issues.
That's exactly, yeah.
Safe number is 500, so that's what we
So test tool limitation. But yeah, I thought it was one or the other. That there was either we just needed to up the limit of the switches, or there was an actual test tool limitation. I didn't know the exact answer, but
But the other one is not a tool limitation. It's a bug.
yeah, the fact that we're at 0 max number of hosts right now, at least the last test run, I pulled these yesterday from the CI environment. There's some kind of problem. I don't know if it's code problem or if there's
Yeah,
actually
it's a
problem.
problem with the host tracker. It's not learning hosts when I try to scale it up. So
Yeah.
I need to look at it.
But I think that in general, if you look at the last 2 slides and you think about what do you know more about Open Daylight, you do know some more. And I think that this is great work. That it's a long way we've came. But if you're trying to deploy this, and if you're trying to figure out if this will work in your environment in a certain use case, I think that there's more work to be done. And that's why we're proposing that we do something more on the system testing level. And with that, I'd like to hand it off to Sandeep to talk more about that.
Hello, my name is Sandeep. I work for HP. I've been doing system testing for HP's proprietary SDN controller for a couple of years now. Trying to get some footsteps on this ODL. I committed a few tests here. The last one, the right hand one, is mine. So there are another one like link scale testing also, which is not shown here. So today I want to talk about what I think is system testing. There could be many definitions, but what I think is system testing is what I'm going to discuss, and why it should be done, and some proposals, some thought-provoking stuff, so that we can start some discussion tomorrow. As Marcus mentioned, scale test or performance test, what we do now is a single dimension test, which is like only one feature at a time. We're trying to scale. But system testing is multiple dimension, multiple transactions at the same time, which is kind of a real deployment scenario. So if you increase the transactions and we go at high load, and then we call it as a stress test. And then, so to me, system testing is not just about passing some test case, but it's also about observing how the system behaves. Let me give one example. Like, I did a ping test, and then what I figured out was ping was all passing fine. And I looked into the logs, and then I found that there are some exceptions. And that exception said, error inserting flows. So then I figured out that at some point of time, because of some stress, there was a case where packets were not programmed, the pings are not going through using flows, but it was going through packet flooding. And that was a real bug, which is very difficult to catch in this kind of situations. Like Mininet, when you do a ping all test, it just says it's pings or not. It doesn't say whether the pings gone through using flow mod insertion or packet flooding. So, but it makes a big difference in testing. So my expectations from system testing is no matter what I do, no crashes. And so I could push the system to a very high load, and then it can happen that the whole system doesn't function for a while, but when I release the load, it should be back functional. That's my expectation. So why I'm doing system testing? So scale test, performance test, all these gives us some fancy numbers, but in real deployment, we can't expect that numbers to be true. So my goal is to find operational limits when I do system testing. Discover very complex bugs. So when I've seen many situations where the features are working pretty fine, but the moment I introduce a system test and there is a interaction between multiple code, multiple plugins, it falls apart. So I get a lot of very complex bugs by doing system testing. And thirdly, I want to understand which task is taking more CPU resources or memory resources, etc. Like earlier days when we used to do switch testing, we had spanning tree. It used to consume a lot of CPU. So here also there should be some guy who consumes a lot of CPU. So we figured that out. So once we understand how and all these plugins work, how much resources it requires, we can do tuning. We can recommend customers, hey, you want to increase the performance, you need to do these tunings. Like you need to increase the heap size, you need to have some thread affinity for a task, or from a controller perspective, you can even adjust priority of a task, if you could. And also, we want to identify overall system configuration. When we say we want to have some 1,000 switch deployment, what should be the system configuration? So what are the plugins should be installed for a particular case? Then it should run as a bare metal or a VM. The host OS on which the controller is going to run, very important. Then how much CPU and other resources I have to provide. Whether for that scale number, will I be able to support high availability too? So, and then there's always been a discussion on how much now we can scale. For let's say Beryllium lease is going to come now, where should be aiming at? And then we should, I think, continually doing some discussion on this one too. So, so what we are trying to propose here is identify some deployment characteristics, like, for example, campus versus data center versus NFV. So campus will have its own plugins versus data center. So identify them and characterize them. We'll find some test requirements and methodologies for each profile, and then test accordingly. And so what should be the acceptance criteria for each profile to be tested against? Then finally, when we do all this testing, we capture all the configurations, and then the test cases, test results, and document them. It should be available to the community, and then they can read and understand what we did, and then they can give feedback. It'll be good learning for app developers too. Yeah.
So these profiles are profiles in the controller itself, like these different distributions. We are taking care of these graphic profiles.
No, it's just
Testing profiles.
Testing profiles.
testing profiles, yeah.
And we'll provide some examples, actually, of each one of those.
Yeah. So again, this is just a proposal. We can talk about it tomorrow. So I just got up some campus scenario. Let's say we have a campus running some northbound applications. There are security apps, VoIP calls app, layer 2, layer 3 switching app. So what we're trying to do is we understand what these apps are going to do with the controller, or what resources of the controller are going to be used. and then we come up with some test vectors. So in this case, this is a very simple example. I know I have to increase the switches. I know how to increase the links. I know how to increase the host. Then whether the topology should be looped or no loops. Then HA scenarios you need to test. We need to do failure test and then fail back, etc. Then regularly we should be targeting at what kind of activities these guys will do, the app guys will do on the controller. So from a campus point, I can nail down like roaming is a very common scenario. So we need to try to trigger roaming cases for hosts. Then new host login. It could be like there is a campus, there's an examination, and there is a lot of guys joining the exam at 9 o'clock in the morning, and then the rate at which the host can be connected to the controller should be tested out at those kind of load. Then how much host traffic the system can handle. From one of the vendors here I talked to, they were saying there should be a lot of like 100,000 flow writing per second, which is what some people are targeting it. So we should be targeting it a lot of northbound activity tests also. We should be targeting it like doing REST calls. We should be targeting as making sample apps, Java apps on top of the controller, which will do REST calls, which is another way of accessing, and then RPC too. So topology changes, that's a common thing, campus networks. So I've seen a case where we had frequent topology changes, and then controller loses track of all the whole network. It's very difficult for it to get all these topology events and compute the new topology every time. So that's a big concern. And GUI access. So this is about campus deployment. I hand it over to Marcus to talk about some other scenarios.
Thanks, Sandeep. So I'm going to talk about a data center use case testing profile. I just want to put it out there that Intel doesn't really have any products associated in this space. So whereas HP might have some concrete experience in real life deployment of their scenarios. We don't have that yet. What we'd like to do is figure out a useful approximation of how we can test this so that we can give people a controller that will have usable performance in whatever the application they're using it for. But I guess the way I would set up a data center test profile is on this slide here. And there are many other ways to do it, but I would have a ODL controller providing network virtualization using OVSDV NetVirt, and it'd be connected to OpenStack as the cloud orchestrator. You'd have the OpenFlow plugin in the mix. It's a dependency of OVSDB, but it's also important for controlling the network, obviously. Service function chaining to chain together service functions that would be used in the data center intrusion prevention service, load balancing, web server, so on and so forth. And if configuration requires these plugins, I don't know why I have it up there for the second portion, but essentially what I think we need to do is think about more how it's being used or how it would be used, and how we can design system tests around testing the performance, the scalability, the stability, and then finally the security in this performance or in this profile. Because right now, obviously we're just getting started with our testing, but I think we need to expand and we need to target something more along these lines. The next testing profile that would be similar, but not the same, would be an NFV system test profile. It would also use service function chaining just because that's a useful tool in this kind of a setup. It would be a GI-LAN use case, but there's a couple others you could do, VCPE, VEPC. And GI-LAN is basically a mobile network that you're using service function chaining to make it dynamic and virtualize some of the service functions. But you would have like service functions that would be like deep packet inspection, video optimizer, NATs, load balancers. You put them in a chain, and then you dynamically associate the traffic to travel through the chain. And key to using an NFV system profile would be S3P testing in general, but you definitely want to have it in a profile that allows you to test things that are key to NFV. But it might require testing using like a high-speed data plane, accelerated OVS, like Intel DPDK. But the profile characteristics are likely proprietary or confidential right now because it's kind of the secret sauce of the telcos, for example. That's how they make their money, is how they set up their internal networks to change over time, provide services, and so on. So I think it'd be harder for us to define a profile, but I still think it's worth trying to find something that's a useful approximation of a real-life scenario. And then running S3P testing based on that. With that, I'd like to hand it off to Christian to go ahead and wrap up.
Okay. So, as I was saying at the beginning, this is a conversation that we want to have with the community. We have Daryl, we have Louis here, who has been doing testing for ODL from before there was ODL. So there's a couple of things that we wanted to discuss in addition to the directional input that we're giving here. First of all, coming from the software world, system testing is something that's very natural, right? And the big question is, does it make sense for ODL now, after the third release, to start developing expertise, associated resources with it, approach the community, and engage in that direction? So I see a lot of people nodding, right? But there's always the situation also that the rubber has to hit the road, right? The second one, the second hypothesis that we're testing here is, with now the greater focus of ODL becoming more associated with production level use cases, right? Is how do we evolve the focus and the mission of the integration team? I'd love to get your feedback on that, to actually reflect that, right? We're not at the stage where ODL was just a bunch of bits. Now it runs in the AT&T network, right? So how do we evolve as a community to reflect the evolving changes and usage of ODL? And then there's some more pragmatic questions, and having gone through this with OpenStack or some other open projects, is who, when, and how do you decide on system limits, right? We can test individual scaling factors or individual factors to very high scale, but if we're really trying to test to an operational limit, is that something that we should have a survey on within the integration test team, right? Should we make this, for example, a question to the advisory team, right? Or the TSC, right? And again, I'm not saying that we have all of the answers here, but we definitely would like to start that conversation. In many projects, that ownership is also within the integration team, right? So the integration team is not just chartered with executing against a defined scope, it can also change the scope, right? And the way ODL works today, the plugin teams have a lot of flexibility to define their own functional tests, right? Those, again, have some impact on what the operational limits are. Right? And ultimately, I think one thing that, certainly from an HP and also from an Intel perspective, we want to get to and like to articulate as a goal for Beryllium is, what are the minimum acceptable criteria for S3P for that release, right? So So lots of questions, actually. I see you're thinking, Luis, what do you?
No, this is a classic question in like, probably the answer you're gonna get from TSC and others is let's do the test first.
Okay.
Let's do the test first. Let's measure, and then we can try to figure out what will be the minimum. It's very difficult to figure out what is the minimum or what is the level that we should achieve without aggressive tests.
Sure. But the question,
So
That conversation will probably happen in parallel with the conversation about promoting projects to stable or mature and the
That's right.
requirements around that.
yeah,
right.
I like though the idea, to be honest here.
Mhm.
This is, I got the connection here with the use cases that we are implementing already with the forum TSC on board. We need to have use cases. Not enough just to do testing the plugins and the application alone. We need to have full use case, campus, NFVs, data center, whatever,
Mm.
and then test those.
Right.
This is what we do. Now, from there to now ask what will be the minimum acceptable. Yeah. First we need to build the test around which my question is also how you plan to do this test because we need some tooling that is quite sophisticated for that.
Sure.
And yeah, maybe you have already
Right,
some
people.
Well,
So let me, before we go into the technical details, I understand that the tests have to come first, but I think the question before is, should there be minimum release gating criteria for beryllium, right? And at the moment,
So the question is back to you, how we come up with a number as a community. We don't have a test to measure. How a community can come up with a number that we said this is the minimum. Because this is what happens with coverage, test coverage, and some other things when they die.
right,
Who is going to tell what is the minimum acceptable?
Usually,
If we are not really measuring or doing anything with that. That's challenge, right?
yeah,
I mean, we ask people that they already have a testing days and see how they're doing. And we did actually for test coverage, calling trying to call some people, what is where you think? In the end, it was like, okay, we need to really measure what we are finding here and then decide.
This is not very subjective, right? If somebody is looking for deploying this in their small data center, they might go to.
that's fine.
But when it's a subjective, you're putting a number on a specific date count and what it should be, that yes.
Right. But to some extent, at the moment, the release of lithium was not gated, I'm just putting this out, by having any kind of performance, right? So the question is, should that change for beryllium, that unless there is a performance, whatever it is, right, we will not release beryllium.
Also, I have the point that, again, I think that this is very important first because especially with performance and scalability,
Uh-huh.
how you build your test, especially what the condition is going to give you more of.
Absolutely, right.
So how you can say in the beginning, I want this to support one of the switches. I don't know, CPU, RAMs, what are the conditions,
Yes.
and so on.
So
That's another challenge.
with the minimum gating criteria, you have to have a golden configuration almost, right? Exactly, right.
Let's go back to the task force performance stuff that we've been batting around.
I mean, maybe
I think the characterization part, right, when you find the profile and characterization, that probably can give you that and you can say, okay, this is was a pattern, this is how we are going to see that the environment is going to be in, and let's see how it performs.
Yeah.
That's where we can try for our best. One is that best is not good enough. Okay, then we need to try to apply it for a higher one. That should be the gate. Okay, that's it. We need this.
and my
Okay.
experience was
Mhm.
is that when you put some of these tests in place, new tests in place, you have seen that already a few samples,
Yeah.
you're going to find out.
Sure.
So that's why,
That's a big one.
particularly myself, I'm most interested in first with the test. Let's fix all the immediate issues that we have there that this uncovers. And after we can think, okay, now that the basic stuff is fixed, yeah, let's try to set up some minimum criteria or something that we all together so community agrees that.
And create configurations that resemble real-world test scenarios.
The
Right.
idea is awesome. So
Right.
that I totally support in so
Okay.
create real scenarios.
So there's,
So in my mind,
mhm.
the companies that are involved in Open Daylight who have their own proprietary controllers before
Right.
have customers and they have deployment and they have information about those deployment and it might be nice if they haven't already for those types of information to come out, you know, to be sanitized, whatever, but give some ideas of what NNC's controller does, how it performs. Give
We agree. We agree. That's ideal, right?
That's open.
Yeah, they,
Part of the whole open concept.
they're like almost an HPVM that are gonna tell you millions and millions of packets in a second. Where's the deployment that needs that?
Well, and, you know, it's like my scale
What about
testing, right? It's great, I can hit the
user?
Yeah.
User group, who's
The
using
user group
this?
could be a good group to get some feedback on what would be the
Yeah.
expectation, like another.
Yeah, that's why we have it on. Right. Rio definitely has some interesting tests, right? There are other projects out there, but I mean, this is one of the great things now is, you know, Sandeep being here and you know, other members coming together that have, again, an experience base from their proprietary STN controller that we want to leverage here. But there are other actions, right, that we can drive either through the board level or the TSC level, the advisory group level, and the user group. And you know, as from a marketing perspective, I need this kind of stuff to help market ODL as well. Right?
And I would say, to Jamo's point, oh, did you have a question? I would say, to Jamo's point about other controllers and whether or not we need that performance, I don't think that we need that performance. In fact, I'm not terribly concerned with comparing to other controllers, although it's useful in some sense. What I'm more concerned about is giving information to people who want to take this and use it as a solution, that we have this amount of performance that's helpful in this use case. So, yeah. And if we set a minimum after we already know where we're at in that range, then I think it's helpful for us as a community. But.
Steven's just such a good example of that, right?
Yeah.
You tweak your SEM controller thing just a bit with millions and millions and millions of
Sure.
huge numbers, but, you know,
But how helpful is that? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
perfect example.
Yeah.
Right.
So as a software developer, I have a slightly different take.
Okay.
My thing is like, what kind of a software profiling does this do for me? Let's say you come up with a number saying it does X number of flows per second. I would like to know where this time is being spent. Like, do I have some unnecessary blockage in my code?
Yeah.
There's
That's.
an algorithm that needs to be improved upon.
Sure.
I was gonna say that's definitely part of the idea, and yeah, we do this already, but yeah.
We've been trying to get people that have that exact interest for a while now. Like, you know, in all of these events, we're like, hey, if you come out with a Java profiler and some background, you could probably find some performance bugs to run quickly and look like a hero to the community because we haven't done very much of that. So.
I'm more interested on the internals, like where is the blockage?
That's what I'm saying.
The memory analysis and CPU analysis, that kind of stuff.
Right. And
Thursdays.
right. And this is right. So you got your recruitment pitch in. Daryl, well done. But this is what Sandeep was talking about, right? Especially with system test, right? This is where you really get you know, information on heap memory allocations and you know, things that are stepping on each other, race conditions, and all of that, right? So that's really where, again, the system test element and focus is going to prove valuable, much more valuable than what we do today. Okay.
Another point, like from my past life, I've done this, right? Testing systems, and then when that product went to the customer, it failed miserably.
Right.
What happened was customer had misconfigured it, and nobody on our side had done a negative testing at scale. So what we had was a memory leak, like so this is our embedded C program. Memory leak, system would run out of memory. So our negative testing was like, run 2 flows, we blocked it, good enough. But when you have 10,000 flows leaking memory, so what I would like to add, like at some point, is a negative test case where things should fail. And is this our system stable enough that it can handle that kind of a pressure?
Yeah, I think that's actually a great point. And again, if you have particular, you know, idea or proposal, I think you will find the community is very open to that.
Oh yeah.
Right. Right. So is it again? The same applies to security testing, right? Putting the system under attack was a DDoS attack, right? And seeing how many OpenFlow rules are actually being programmed. So yes, but we got to start somewhere, right? And this is a conversation about direction, right? Right. And step by step, right? For Beryllium right now, again, our proposal is we should, you know, since we're in the starting stages of defining, right, how we're going to get the Beryllium release out, is for the integration team as a proposal, right, as input, let's focus on system testing, right, and let's focus on creating some test configuration to reflect real-world use cases, right? And then if we can engage with other partners, let's see whether it makes sense to have minimum gating criteria, right? That's really, in a nutshell, that's what this session is all about. Okay, questions in the back?
It depends on the scenario. So you asked me where that automated. So from an ODL perspective, I can talk about only the scale and performance testing are automated right now. The system testing, multiple transaction, those tests are not automated. Yeah, it's a big challenge to automate it. So that should be one of our big challenges in doing this testing. Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
definitely should.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, second question in the back. All right, actually behind you first, and then I'll yeah. Sure. Sure, garbage collection, sure, in Java, yeah. Sure. Absolutely. Right. And again, some of the,
Thank you too about that. It used to affect us a lot more than it does now, but we've looked at that some. I can connect with you offline.
yeah, and some of the profiler comments that Daryl had, maybe aligned with that, right? Right, right. Okay, we had one more question. Oh, actually, now in the back, yeah, and then. Restart.
You're talking about experience with my proprietary controller?
For ODL, are there any specific scenarios?
No,
like
we
for
have never
restarting
tried
control?
the system level testing for ODL. But I can tell you from experience, restarting controllers can really cause troubles for the whole system, especially when you have HA, multiple controllers, and then you restart one controller. Yeah, it's a big, big deal.
Yeah. So and certainly, some of the things that are on wish lists from Colin, right, around clustering and then HA, they will again stretch our test efforts in new areas as well, right? So to some extent, we will always be a little bit in the catch-up position, right? But the purpose of this session is to kind of put a directional framework together so that we can anticipate the test needs of the next release. Okay, question. We left. Yeah. Go.
I was just going to ask about downstream projects, requirements. What requirements projects and the testing projects that we currently know we can do, they might be new racks and stuff.
That's a great. Actually, I can maybe take a first
Okay,
step,
sure.
and
Yeah,
then Marcus.
was
So yes,
just-
there's a lot of excitement about the focus of OPNFV as a midstream project, right? And certainly from a mission perspective, right, focus on func test and integrating in an entire stack and characterizing it for telco use cases, great. But ODL is not just used for telco, right? That's why the configurations and for campus, for IoT is important, right? For NFV, sure. Hopefully, with the Brahmaputra release, we will actually get something that is a little bit more meaningful. So far, Arno it's like if it was a house, they're putting in the sewage pipes, right? It's a first step in building a code stack, right? So the other thing is, as a community, should we be building a dependency on another project to characterize our stack. I don't think that's actually the right policy going forward, right? It can be, it can augment what we're doing, but it should not be that we're kind of outsourcing the characterization of ODL to another project.
Yeah, you go ahead. I mean, I'm sure you're going to say basically what I'm going to say. No, go ahead.
Okay. So there's been a bunch of conversations going on in the last couple of weeks around essentially this topic, around doing performance testing in the OpenFlow context, largely because they have so many labs, giant labs sitting there unused, and we have lots of performance tests that we would like to run on them. And so we've been kind of informally trying to figure out the right way to do that without whether we should create a new ODL project that's focused on that, but that adds extra overhead of another project, and whether we should do a task force thing inside ODL that is going to go work with the new projects with OpenFlow to do some bigger system tests like that. So that's an active conversation that's going on, and we're going to be hammering it out a lot more during the dev design phase.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely one of the things that OpenFE has established, and there's even an Interlab in Oregon, right, which is an official OpenFE lab. There are labs in China, all over the world. And I guess one of the questions is, how do we effectively plug into them without building an execution dependency?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just wondering if, because I just into this openly, right, and if it exists or not. Do we have any tests that are just doing it on the IO level? So this is the input, and if it sends, for example, it tries to install a flow, then it catches it on that output port, and then
More like a black box test? Is that what you?
no, because from testing point of view, for example, as a developer, sometimes I just want that I can use another laptop to push the limits of so I don't need to have a full meeting net functionality just to test some cases, to test the performance of some specific cases. I just need that if this is the REST input and then it tries to install a flow, then I can check the packets that are going out from OpenDaylight and inspect those packets.
Like a quick test kind of thing?
Yeah, but pushing for performance also.
That's an interesting
There is a
concept.
test that I believe, did you make it, Jamo? It's basically using the REST interface to install an OpenFlow flow and then measure the end-to-end performance.
But that requires an underlying network, right? So you still need to close all those sorts of issues.
Still, our network is like a dummy plugin or something that just analyze the packet and say if the packet is correct or not.
What you're talking about requires
Yeah.
No, we don't have that feeling.
Yeah, but as a concept, right, for especially application developers who are not in the guts of ODL, having a simple, quick test, for lack of a better term, that's actually a great idea. Yeah. Good. All right. So, again, this presentation was meant to spur interaction, right? It's directional, and certainly what you're seeing here is also the commitment from both HP and from Intel to continue to provide input into the integration team, to dedicate resources along some of these lines, right? Not just to create tests, but also create tests with a purpose.
Yeah. One of the first things that I put before this, so this is the definition of these use cases. Or I know because in the past, any attempt to do this has a lot of discussion. Right?
Sure.
And people think that plugin has to be in the campus because they think the campus is for them. And so it's something that we should start some conversation. And in the end, if there is no agreement, I believe in integration or someone should say, okay, this is the decision. So
Yes.
we must decide. We cannot just stick here.
That's right.
But I think it's very interesting to start there because when we have a well definition, what is a campus use case or what is a data center use case, after that we can do a
That's right. That's right. All right. Great. With that, thank you very much for the very active discussion and for your input. And we're all here for further questions. So first of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Chris Buerger. I'm a technologist within Intel's SDN division. I'm also the chair of the ODL marketing work group. And what we're going to talk about today is actually executing against a vision that, and a term that you've heard over and over again here at the event, and that is S3P. Testing ODL for stability, for scalability, for security, and for performance. And that is such a big topic, actually, that I've brought along 2 engineers with me, and I'm going to quickly introduce them. Sandeep from HP, as well as Marcus from Intel. And all 3 of us are going to engage in new Evolve. And these 2 activities are actually very simple. One of them is to test ODL at a system level. And for many of us who have done software testing, system level testing has a particular meaning, right? It involves testing the system under test or the software under test from multiple vectors at the same time. The second key idea that we're going to talk about today is to develop profiles, effectively a set of test methodologies and test scripts that are specific to particular use cases. Right? What we have talked about, what we've heard at the conference today and yesterday was that there are use cases that you as a community have prioritized as key use cases for this. And he's going to start the conversation and go into more details on the current state of affairs with regards to CI testing.
Hello, my name is Marcus Williams.
Whoops.
I just got Marcus Williams. I'm a network software engineer with Intel. I work on the SDN controller team working on Open Daylight. So I'm hopeful that this is accurate, but since this community is ever changing, I actually had to change the slide about a half hour ago after I saw an actual presentation at an OpenFlow program, because I hadn't actually known about a couple of the tests. But I guess what I'd like to say is that there's currently a limited amount of scalability, stability, security, and performance testing happening in Open Daylight right now. But going forward, it's going to be ever important for people adopting Open Daylight for
ODL. NFV is one of them. Campus is another one. The data center is another one. And we're going to provide some food for thought and hopefully some discussion along those kind of proposals to structure our test effort to more closely align with key use cases that you as the community have identified. So another point that I want to highlight is that we don't have all of the answers here. This is meant to be a directional discussion around a number of proposals. So if you have any thoughts, comments, input during the presentation, by all means. We don't have to wait until the end and when the distance to the cold beer is getting shorter and shorter. Let's have a conversation here and do that. And with that, I'll just hand it off to Mark with a conversation about this topic. How do we actually test ODL not only at the component level, but also at a system level? And that's where you find the meaning behind the title for the session. So what are we going to talk about today? Essentially, we're going to start the conversation with a review of where we're at. What is the status quo that we've accomplished with lithium? Then we'd like to structure a conversation with you around 2 new concepts that we're going to propose to the community with regards to improving the way ODL is tested in the future. Some of them are going to be, we believe, implementable within the beryllium timeframe, but some of them are probably more directional of where we'd like to see the test effort evolve.